I'm Dr. Ryan Holsapple, and I'm currently converting to Orthodox Christianity. And today I'm going to show you why I believe Jung's psychology might actually lead to a secret nihilism. You see, it all starts around 1913, where Jung broke from Freud, and shortly after started having these visionary experiences. They were quite profound, and what he started experiencing were all these different components of what he called the collective unconscious. But at the time, it was a very intense and turbulent experience for him. It can be found in his book, which I'm holding up right here, called The Red Book. It was actually a series of journal entries that were originally compiled in the Black Books, but later got edited into a single volume. Now, as somebody who has come to Christ in my life through my own sense of desperation and my own turmoil, I understand and actually deeply empathize with Jungian psychology. I actually love Jung, but as somebody who has now found my Christian faith, I put Christ first, and that means that everything I do gets tested against him. And I'm working on, as a convert, continuing to make my career compatible with serving Christ. And what that means is I have to look at some of my previous ideas and notions and academic studies, and I have to conform them to the life of Christ. And today we're going to do that by looking at Jungian psychology, which I have an expertise in, and seeing how some of his psychological ideas might have led to this secret nihilism. And it starts, as I said, with the Red Book. And in the Red Book, there's a section called the 7 Sermons to the Dead. And in this section, you're going to hear now what Jung was intuiting in his process.
God and devil are distinguished by the qualities fullness and emptiness, generation and destruction. Effectiveness is common to both. Effectiveness, therefore, standeth above both, is a God above God, since in its effect it uniteth fullness and emptiness. This is a God whom ye knew not, for mankind forgot it. We name it by its name Abraxas.
Here Jung does something very interesting, in my opinion. He is essentially, through this process of the Red Book, these visionary experiences, which were quite profound and intriguing, especially as I began to study Jung more deeply years ago. They have a very spiritual undertone to them because he's engaging with these sort of spiritual entities, which he later reconceptualized as figures in the collective unconscious that come out of this psychic underground. But nonetheless, he's being guided by these sort of foreign spirits, right? And this idea of Abraxas is so interesting because it tries to state that God is a God of good and evil, that God is beyond good and evil, but God is also the source of good and evil. It's quite foreign to actual Christian thinking. And Jung had sort of articulated this in more full force later in his essay, Answer to Job, which is in volume 11 of the Collected Works. And in Answer to Job, he basically makes the argument that the incarnation of Jesus Christ was a compensation for God's own darkness, which is shown by his sort of mean behavior towards Job in Answer to Job. Now, if you're anybody who's familiar with Orthodox Christianity, this is going to be a very foreign interpretation that we would never characterize God in such a way. But nonetheless, this is how Jung read it. But it's important to see what the antecedents are to Jung's thinking. You see, Jung was not a rationalist. He did not come to his ideas by just thinking through logically. Part of the reason he broke from Freud is because he didn't think Freud was making enough room for the full diversity of the psyche. Jung truly wanted to honor the multiplicity of the psyche in a way that was not just narrowed down to sexual libido, but rather had a much more full range of energy and imagination. And Jung was doubtlessly brilliant. So now, by the time we get to Answer to Job, he's rationalizing what he experiences that he had already had, visionary experiences of the god Abraxas. And we will take a look here and see how that was articulated and what the consequences are.
If we become aware of a dark side within ourselves, which can be very painful, very confronting, there is, of course, a tendency to move towards the good, right? To redeem what you thought sinful or bad and to become a better person, and then to identify with that new position of being good. In the Bible, that transition is quite extreme. Yahweh being openly violent, revengeful, towards Christ, who is completely peaceful. He has, of course, his outbursts, some outbursts, but he represents a summum bonum, right? A representation of the all-loving God. And this move within Yahweh is so extreme that Jung, psychoanalytically, sees a danger there. He says the possibility that Yahweh, in spite of all the precautionary measures and in spite of his express intention to become the summum bonum, might yet revert to his former ways is not so remote that one need not keep one eye open for it, right? So he sees a danger that Christ, being the summum bonum, represses again a dark side within Yahweh that will.
Again, here it's so interesting because it's very foreign to the actual Christian theology, which says that God is light and in him is no darkness, right? And that's from the first epistle of John. But in Jung's view, that's merely a one-sided religious presentation coming from the psyche, but that the psyche itself reveals to us through the scripture and through the symbols of the psyche that God, how we conceptualize God psychically, is equal parts darkness and light. Now, that to me leads to nihilism. And the reason it leads to nihilism is that if we have this view of God, that God is the source of all bad things and all good things, then our relationship to God becomes one of indifference. We are simply trying to navigate our relationship to the psyche, to created world, as somebody who is trying to straddle these two extremes and therefore try to make the best out of sort of a neutral, uninterested in universe, which ultimately is way beyond any meaningful contact that we can make. In essence, what I'm trying to say is that when we go beyond good and evil, we actually lose meaning. So I don't want to make it seem like Jung was a nihilist. He wasn't a nihilist. But what I'm saying is that by putting God in the psyche, by creating a psychic totality that represents the image of God, we erect an idol, right? And it's not the same thing as saying human beings were made in the image of God. It's saying that the psyche itself represents a Godhead to us, functionally speaking, so that when we read scripture, God is being sort of reduced to a psychic process.
Namely, how Jesus dies on the cross. And Jung says, from a God who is a loving Father, who is actually love itself, one would expect understanding and forgiveness.
So Jung here is responding to Western theology. And in Eastern Orthodoxy, this just clearly is not the understanding. And those of you who are more educated and more experienced with Orthodoxy, please write in the comments just how far away this is from true Orthodox thinking. But in my view, as someone who's new, it's simply not the case that we're doing a penal substitution. It's not like God's wrath has to be poured out on Christ because his anger was not satisfied, and in order to be reconnected with human beings, he had to harm his son. That's not the understanding of Christian theology from an Orthodox perspective. That's that Christ as God entered into our suffering with us. And I find it interesting that instead of saying, wow, Job had to go through so much, and yet God still restored him after everything that he went through. He restored him, and he gave him much more than he ever had to begin with. And that, yes, it was hard, but look what Christ did also. Christ entered into that suffering with us, and he showed us that Job's not the only one. You're not the only one that has to go through unfair suffering. That even Christ himself said, I will enter into this suffering with you through my crucifixion, which restores the concept of suffering to meaning.
God is light. In him there is no darkness at all.
So what we're being taught here is not to integrate our sin. It is to strive to righteousness, to strive to the light of God, to confess our sin, which is, from an Eastern Orthodox perspective, much more about relationship with God, not about judicial legalistic judgment, right? It's not about saying, here's all the bad things I did, period. I broke these laws. It's about saying, here's all the ways in which I turn my back on relationship with the loving Creator. Now, what happens when we get to this nihilistic point? I believe the natural result is that the God of the psyche isn't really a God at all. It's an idol, right? So that by saying that good and evil are just parts of God's wholeness, and that we need to work towards a new ethic where we navigate the psyche, we integrate the shadow, we integrate the sin, we integrate these aspects of the psyche rather than discerning and differentiating and creating boundaries between things. By integrating, we land in this place where we're moving towards nothing. Because if you're not moving towards a loving Creator, you're moving towards a Creator that's beyond good and evil, you yourself are washed away in the indifference of polarities. By not having a single value that transcends all other values, you yourself become subject to bouncing around between an infinite amount of values, an indefinite amount of values, okay? And that's where the psychologist James Hillman comes in. Because James, a brilliant psychologist, and I can't say enough, these guys, I've learned so much from these wonderful scholars, you know? So it's not about bashing them. I'm just sharing where I'm now as I'm coming into the Christian faith. It's a much different place. But James comes along, Dr. Hillman, and says, look, all this talk about the self and this monotheistic God of the psyche, what's really going on there? How are we justifying that? Isn't it really more logical to say that, and more robust to say that there's multiple images of the psyche? Isn't the psyche more polytheistic than monotheistic if you really just look at it? All the different impulses and styles of consciousness that exist. And so he came up with this new way of approaching psychology, and he even wrote a book called Revisioning Psychology, published in 1976, I believe, where he positioned the psychic project as one that is supposed to go into the imagery, to celebrate a polytheistic psyche where all the images have their own agenda. And we just need to let the images stand on their own. The images in depth psychology are the different characters, impulses, archetypes of the psyche. So, you know, the hero would be an image, or the mother would be an image, or the athlete would be an image, right? They're characters that have their own agency, that have their own orientation and goals. And we all have these different parts within us, right? But in Hillman's psychology, these different parts, they're not supposed to come back into a whole, right? They're supposed to just be explored on face value, which is why it's polytheistic. And he even had a whole section of revisioning psychology called Falling Apart. Let yourself go into the images. Stop trying to put yourself together. Stop trying to bring all these images together. Let it all fall apart, right? Now, what is that in the Christian faith? That's death, right? Disintegration. Whereas in a Christian ethos, we're oriented towards Christ, right? Christ organizes our values. Therefore, all the subpersonalities, all the different parts that exist within the psyche, the different impulses, if we oriented them properly, they will exist within a wholeness, a whole person that's oriented towards Christ. The essence is we're not supposed to integrate everything, but we're supposed to have discernment around what it is we choose to integrate and be curious about what the intentions of the different parts of us have. And are they oriented towards love and value of Christ, or are they oriented towards a different value system? And if not, if they're oriented towards a different value system, the question becomes, how do we reorient them? Not how do we integrate them and explore them? And he has some very interesting things to say, but I think it's in defense of James Hillman. He's just following from where Jung left off, and he's just pressing a good question, which is, why should we accept your psychic monotheism, which isn't really based in a real character of God, but has been deifying the psyche itself? And so he uses this myth as an example of his different way of seeing this. Let's take a look.
The accusation against the puer man is infidelity.
The puer in archetypal psychology is the eternal child, the Peter Pan, okay? The boy that doesn't want to grow up. wants to play and explore and travel and do all sorts of novel things.
But the question is, to what is he faithful? Where is your fidelity in your infidelities? And in the marriage thing, if that's the God or goddess ruling this relationship, then the only fidelity that counts is the marriage fidelity. I'm going to interrupt you guys just for a minute. I want to...
Okay, just to translate that a little bit. What he's saying is that fidelity is subjective. It's relative. And it's one of the things he was good at trying to reposition psychology within, is this relativity. It's a matter of what the value is. So if the value is marriage, well, then the value is marriage. But if the value is having an affair, the value is having an affair. So if in essence is, when you just follow the psyche on its own merits, he's saying that you just see these multiple images. These multiple images just want what they want. They do what they do. It is what it is. And you're following the values. They're not oriented towards a higher value. Indeed, there are many forms of faithfulness, but that does not give us a moral injunction. Okay? So in other words, that the psyche is multiple is true. We see that just by observation. People do different things for different reasons. It's that simple. We have multiple different urges, desires, subpersonalities, you could call them. But that happens does not mean that we ought to have this polytheistic view of it. Because when you deify the psyche and you separate the psyche from a metaphysical true God, and you therefore create this image of God that's separate from God as such in the psyche, the natural result of that is you're going to get into this nihilistic territory that Hillman goes into, where it's like, well, we're just going to follow things where they go, but there's no cohesive principle of bringing things back together. Because where would we go? And why would we go there? What value orientation would there be? It's all relative, right? Why should one person of the psyche, one subpersonality, one mythological figure have an ontological advantage over another when they're all just happening? It wouldn't. But when you have God, metaphysically, all of a sudden your values get arranged into a hierarchy, and there are certain things worth investing in more than others if you want to be faithful to God. So the question of faithfulness, if it's only oriented towards psychology, turns into relativism and nihilism. But the question of faithfulness, if it's oriented towards Christ, turns into meaning and salvation. So that all these different parts of us get organized towards a higher purpose. None of us would argue that Christ washes out our personality or our multiplicity. I'm somebody who's an athlete. I enjoy playing sports. I also enjoy reading books. When I'm reading books, I'm not exactly in the same frame of mind as when I'm playing a sport. It's a different motivational system that exists within my psyche. But we all know that I can be playing sports separated from Christ, or I can be playing sports oriented towards Christ. So it's not about washing out the multiplicity and turning into this dull, homogeneous figure that doesn't have any personality. No, it's about entering into our life with a relationship with Christ. Just like I can make this video totally focused on my own pride and how I sound and how you're going to perceive it, or I can make this video with the intention of maybe something I say glorifies Christ, albeit even if I do it clumsily and wrong, right? So we need to heal. In psychology, we need to heal our relationship with God. The psyche is not God. The psyche is not an idol to be worshipped. And by putting God in this position where he's good and evil, you lead yourself into a place where there really is no true ultimate meaning. And in fact, the Red Book does talk about that. Supreme meaning and meaninglessness. Now, Jung would argue, based on the text of the Red Book, and saying argue is a strong term because it's very imaginative. Jung imagined in the Red Book that the truest meaning was this amalgamation between meaning and meaninglessness. But I just don't think that's the case. I think Christ is the ultimate coherent meaning. And if we orient ourselves towards Christ, then we are positioned to not fall prey to a polytheistic psychology like James Hillman, where everything's relative, but organize our values in relationship to how we can serve him. So that all of the activities we do, whether we're mothering or fathering or teaching or reading or running or caregiving, all of them can be to the glory of God. So multiplicity is not opposed to monotheism. It has to be within monotheism. It has to be subjected to God, right? It's when we turn the multiplicity into an end in of itself that we have a problem. I hope some of this made sense, and I was able to translate this Jungian stuff into somewhat approachable terms.